And now we're live with author David Maraniss. He'll be talking about his many books, and you can participate by calling or texting in during the program, or by sending in your questions via email, Twitter, or Facebook.
David Maraniss, what inspired you to write about Detroit in 1963?
It was probably the oddest inspiration I've had for any of my books, truthfully. It was Super Bowl Sunday, 2011. I was in New York City in a bar across the street from the Circle in the Square Theater, where a play, Lombardi, inspired by my book When Pride Still Mattered, was playing. And I was there with a cast of Lombardi watching the Packers in the Super Bowl, which was sort of surreal in the first place. And I was standing next to Dan Lauria, who played Lombardi in the play. And we were looking up at the screen at halftime. I was all nervous, because I'm a Packers fan. And there was Dan Lauria on the screen playing Lombardi in this little skit that the network had him do. And then all of a sudden there was a commercial. And I wasn't really focused, but I saw a freeway sign in the commercial that said Detroit, and that caught my attention. And then this sort of evocative backbeat of music and all of the iconic symbols of Detroit, the Joe Louis fist downtown, the Diego Rivera murals of Detroit industry, these incredible murals evoking the manufacturing hub of Detroit, the sculpture, the spirit of Detroit downtown, and then this black sedan driving up Woodward Avenue, the main thoroughfare of Detroit. And then you see Eminem in the car. I'm not an Eminem guy. I mean, I am now, but I wasn't then. But I love the music that was playing in the background. And he drives up the street and gets out at the Fox Theater, this glorious old restored theater in downtown Detroit, and walks down the aisle, and there's a black gospel choir on stage, rising in song, and Eminem turns to the camera and says, "This is the Motor City, and this is what we do." And, I choked up watching it. It really got to me in some way, and my wonderful wife, would say, why are you falling for this? They're just selling Chryslers, and Detroit's a mess. And that was true, but it got me thinking about what Detroit meant to me. I was born in Detroit. I lived there the first 6.5 years of my life, mostly. And my earliest, strongest memories are of that city. And that commercial provoked something in me that set me on the path to thinking about, what do? I write. How can I honor this city that means so much to my earliest thoughts and my family's? And then I started sort of, over the course of several months, figuring out how to do the book, Once in a Great City.
Why did you focus on 1963?
Well, one of the ways that I operate, for most of my work, I use the metaphor, set my oil rig somewhere and drill as deeply as I can. So that's part of the way I work. But what I wanted to do in the first place was honor this city, what Detroit gave America, which is an enormous amount. So I started thinking about those threads. What did Detroit give America? Well, it was the heart of the labor movement under the United Auto Workers. It was very important to civil rights during the 1960s, connected in part to those auto workers, but in terms of supporting the Southern Civil Rights Movement and all of the activities that were going on in Detroit. It created Motown, the soundtrack of my generation, and it's, of course, first and foremost, the center of the automobile industry. So I wanted to write about those four aspects of what Detroit gave America at their strongest. And that took me to a specific era. Motown only existed in Detroit from 1959 to 1970 about. And I wanted early Motown. That took me into the early 60s. The first Motortown Review left Detroit in October of 1962. I saw that as possibly a good place to start. It turned out very quickly as I was looking at those four threads that the Detroit Auto Show opened that very same week in October of 62, introducing the 1963 cars that sold more than ever before. I took one further step about civil rights and saw that Martin Luther King came to this city that very summer of 63, 6 months later, and delivered his I Have a Dream speech in Detroit before he did it in Washington. And also that the Walter Reuther was central to all of that, and the United Auto Workers. So I had the four threads right there in that specific period.
Well, I'm going to show some video, and I want you to tell us what this is and who you're talking about.
Walter Reuther was the president of the United Auto Workers during its heyday from the 1940s through 1970 when he died in a plane crash. And he really was instrumental in two important ways. One was bringing the United Auto Workers into the middle class, and another was he was a progressive leader who believed that that chance to get into the middle class rested on equality. So he was also very strong in terms of supporting and pushing civil rights for everyone. And when you think of the people who really transformed America during the 20th century, I think Walter Reuther is a very important and under-recognized figure.
What was it?
I'm sorry?
What was that video that we just saw?
That was done by Simon & Schuster, my publisher, sort of to promote the book in different ways. Walter Reuther, as I say at the end there, I consider one of the most important under-recognized figures of the 20th century. And he did it all in Detroit. You know, he came from West Virginia, came to Detroit as a very young man with his brothers, Victor and Roy, who all three of them helped develop the United Auto Workers. He had to negotiate a very difficult situation over many years with tension from the auto industry. The Ford goons beat him up, and the left wing of the auto workers union, the communist aspect of it, didn't like him either. He found his way through all of that, and was a very progressive, rational force in the American labor movement for a very long time. Very close to both President John Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson. Extremely strong on civil rights. The United Auto Workers' role in helping the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King is very important.
David Maraniss, you've been writing books for over 20 years now. The way they're promoted, is this new that Simon & Schuster is putting out video trailers?
I won't say. Yes, it is. The publishing industry, sort of like my other industry, the newspaper business, you know, sort of only understands the future a little late, right? But yes, they're in the 21st century now. They are using social media, and they are finding these different ways to promote books, which is part of the game.
When it comes to topics, this is what you write in your book, They Marched into Sunlight. Connections are what fascinate me, the connections of history and of individual lives, the accidents, incidents, and intentions that rip people apart and sew them back together. These interest me more than ideological formulations that pretend to be certain of the meaning of it all.
Well, I'm trying to be very honest about the fact that I'm not an ideologue. I have very strong political beliefs, but I try to look for the truth first. And if the truth doesn't fit what I think, then I move. And I'm really more interested in sociological forces that shape people and why they are the way they are. As I would call myself a humanist in the sense that I look for the best in people. I'm not blind to flaws, but I think every human being has flaws. I think, you know, it's just an exaggeration, some over others. And so I'm also never trying to preach to the choir. I think that's a waste of time. You know, it can get you popular. In this modern world, you get more hits the more provocative you are. But my interest always is to trying to find the truth and and the complexity of truth. And in this modern American culture, complexity is not often what people are looking for. But it's what I'm looking for.
From your book, Into the Story. People often assume that I'm first and foremost a political writer who occasionally dabbles in sports, turning from serious work to play. I've never looked at it that way. There is much about politics that is utterly trivial and boring to me, and much about sports that is inherently dramatic or sociologically interesting. It is not the general subject that draws me, but the possibilities of a particular story.
Yes, I have spent most of my journalism career, or much of it, writing about politics, starting with covering Maryland politics in the late 70s, and then national presidential. I sort of became the Post's profiler or biographer of presidential candidates starting in the early 80s. Did Gary Hart, then Jesse Jackson, then Bill Clinton, and Clinton again, and Bob Dole some, and Al Gore. So I've done a lot of that over the years, but I've never really been one of those people that lives or dies with the latest polls or a lot of the sort of gotcha stories that are really ridiculous that come and go every week. I've always tried to work on the theory that I'm trying to build something substantive and substantial so that over the course of a year I've illuminated some subject. And that's the way I've always approached it. So, and to get to that larger point, one of my mentors was David Halberstam, and he once talked about going to the toy department to write his sports books. I completely disagree with that. I liked his sports books, but they were much more illuminating than some of his other work. And I think that sports offers the opportunity to write about several, along with the drama, which is similar to politics in the sense that there are winners and losers, and there's a contest, and there's certain drama to that. But sports is really one of the key ways to write about some of the major sociological issues of the United States, including especially race. And I've always been interested in that.
Vince Lombardi, you moved to Green Bay for a season, for a winter. Roberto Clemente, you moved to Puerto Rico.
Well, spent a lot of time there.
Spent a lot of time there.
Yes.
Barack Obama, you traveled to Africa, Indonesia, Hawaii. Why is it important to get into the physical space?
That's the first law of how I would do things. Go there, wherever it is. It's only by really immersing yourself in the geography and the culture of a place that you can start to understand the forces that shape someone. And so for Lombardi, for instance, first I moved to New York for 2 summers with my wife, Linda. Because that's really where he was shaped. He grew up in Sheepshead Bay. He went to Fordham University. He taught high school football across the river in Englewood, New Jersey. He was an assistant coach at West Point and then for the New York Giants. So that he was 45 years old before he got to Green Bay. But then Green Bay tells so much about those magical 9 years when he went from 45-year-old assistant coach to an American icon, winning 5 championships in those 9 years. And just one part of it is that the football aspect of the book, and the book is about much more than football. It's about the mythology of competition and success in American life, about leadership, about the costs, what it takes and what it costs. But the football aspect of the book, the climax, is the Ice Bowl. New Year's Eve, 1967, minus 17 degrees in Green Bay, Packers against the Cowboys. Final drive, Packers win in the last seconds. I had to endure a Green Bay winter to understand what that meant. And not only did that help me understand that, but it helped me understand the entire culture of essentially a one-company town. When Linda and I moved to Green Bay, about a week after we were there, we both got terrible earaches. And in the middle of the night, we had to drive down from Brussels, Wisconsin, in southern Door County, where we were living, into the city to a hospital to get treated for those earaches. And when you went into the hospital, every doctor's door had a little jersey on it. It was either a number 4 for Brett Favre or 92 for Reggie White. After a couple of weeks, Linda came home and said, I feel out of uniform. She had to go to Kohl's department store and buy a green and gold sweatshirt to wear because everybody else was wearing them. So all of these little things add up. Another thing that happened, Peter, is once we got there, everybody all of a sudden knew we were there. The local barmaid told everybody, the postmistress. So it was, this the local paper ran a story. Clinton biographer is in Green Bay writing a biography of Vince Lombardi. They published my telephone number in the story, my local number. So all of a sudden I get bombarded with all these calls from people. And this was still the day when you had a regular phone and an old-fashioned answering machine that you'd push the button and it'd play back all the... So I'd come home from a day of research And there'd be many, many messages on the machine. I pushed the button. Well, the first guy said, "I hear you're writing a book about Guy Lombardo." Well, not quite. But then there were all these other messages that were incredibly valuable that I would not have found if I had not moved there. A guy who was the caddy at Oneida Golf and Riding Club, who caddied for Lombardi and told me about his temper and how he'd have to take irons out of the river when Lombardi hit a bad shot, but also about how generous a tipper Lombardi was, and about how he was the one golfer there who always insisted on having the Oneida Indians, those caddies, caddy for him, because there are a lot of other rich little kids who would caddy, but he wanted the Indians who knew it meant more to them to have that job. There was another guy who played the piano at Alex's Crown Restaurant in Appleton and would describe how Lombardi and Marie would go down there with their cronies on Friday nights and walk in, and the piano player would have to play a medley from My Fair Lady and let Marie Lombardi sing along. He didn't like sing-alongs. And then he described how generous tipper Lombardi was, that he would give a very generous tip to everybody who worked there, the piano player, the maitre d', the server, the chef, but he would deduct $1 from everyone's tip if someone came back and bothered him while he was eating. And that's sort of classic Lombardi, too. So many stories I got by moving there, and that's true of every one of my books. It's just invaluable to me to feel the culture and find those types of stories.
Where'd you come up with the title, When Pride Still Mattered?
I stole it. But of course, I credited the person that I took it from and called him and got his blessing. It was Richard Ford, the novelist, in one of his books about the ex-sports writer in New Jersey. It was sort of a trilogy he wrote. The middle one was called Independence Day. And somewhere in that book, the main character is driving up the New Jersey Turnpike and stops at the Vince Lombardi rest stop, where I have been many times. And in this wonderful riff about it, in parentheses, he wrote, "When Pride Still Mattered." And I saw that and said, yeah, that's it. It has a double meaning to it. I mean, of course, Lombardi evokes this great pride, but I also write very much in my book about the fallacy of the innocent past, and everybody looks at the past as something glorious and better, and there's always more shades to it than that. So When Pride Still Mattered connected for me.
Lombardi believed in fair play, you write. He told his players, but not in the concept of good losing. He equated a loss with a sin. Quote, "I don't want any good losers around here. If you think it's good to be a loser, give the other guy the opportunity. Good losing," he said, "was just a way to live with yourself. It's a way to live with defeat."
Lombardi was obsessed with football and with winning. But I should also point out that the adage that is most often attributed to Vince Lombardi on that subject, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing, is not his. He did not coin it. He didn't even really believe it, in a sense. I did a sort of an etymology of it and found out that it was first uttered publicly by a young 12 or 13-year-old actress in a John Wayne movie, Trouble Along the Way. And she was talking to a social worker played by Donna Reed. At halftime of a game, Donna Reed is complaining about how John Wayne, who's the coach of this small Catholic football team that's been cheating and getting pro players from Canada and all these other ways of cheating, Donna Reed turns to the little girl and says, "This is not right. Why is he doing all this?" And the little girl says, "Well, don't you know winning isn't everything, it's the only thing?" I sort of traced how that came to that screenplay from another coach who had been moved out to UCLA and was close to the screenwriter out there. Lombardi, honestly, was much tougher on his team when they won but played poorly than if they played well and lost. But he understood, and particularly as a professional coach, that if you don't win, you're gone. And that's true of the players, too. So there's always that tension in sports between winning and other things. But in professional sports, it's a little less so. It's pretty clear that you have to win.
Was Vince Lombardi political?
I wouldn't. He was surprisingly. He wasn't active politically, but he liked the Kennedys. He was an Irish Catholic. He identified very strongly with John Kennedy, who coincidentally helped him get Paul Hornung out of the reserve to play in a couple of key games in the early 60s. And then actually supported Bobby Kennedy in 68. His wife, Marie, was a conservative Republican. But in 1968, according to some sources, Richard Nixon loved Lombardi and actually asked John Mitchell to check into him as a possible running mate. And Mitchell came back and said, well, you know, Lombardi's great, but the truth is he's a Kennedy Democrat.
October 1967. What was going on in the country?
Well, it was the middle of the Vietnam War. It was a very dynamic time, I would say. That you asked that question because it's the center of my book, They Marched into Sunlight, which is about a protest at the University of Wisconsin against Dow Chemical Company that turned into a police riot, basically. And a battle in Vietnam was going on that same 24-hour period in which a battalion of the 1st Infantry Division, the Black Lions Battalion, went off on a search and destroy mission and got destroyed. Everything is up in the air in October of 1967. It's right after the Summer of Love in San Francisco. The counterculture is strong. The anti-war movement is growing. But nobody knows where anything's going to go for the war and the anti-war. It's a few months before the Tet Offensive when the public turned for good against the Vietnam War. It's a period when Lyndon Johnson, as president, and the commanding general in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, are pushing for more troops, thinking that they can win the war simply through attrition, through finding the Viet Cong and killing more of them. They'll win the war. So all of that is happening at this very combustible moment in October of 1967. And that's where I try to draw the story of Vietnam from in those 2 days.
Where were you?
I was at the University of Wisconsin. I was a freshman, a townie. I grew up in I spent much of my childhood in Madison. Went to high school there. I was wearing my first blue jean jacket. My hair was growing out a little bit. I witnessed but did not participate in the Dow protest. It was an act of civil disobedience of people who opposed the war marching into the building, the Commerce Building, where the Dow Chemical Company was interviewing students for prospective hiring. And they sat down in the very narrow, dark, dank main hallway of the Commerce Building. It's sort of, when you go in there, you feel like you're in a submarine almost. A few hundred people were in there. And I was on the edge of the crowd outside watching as the Madison police arrived at the Carillon Tower across the street near the Sociology Building and marched into the building with their batons out and saw the kids come flying out shortly afterwards, many of them with bloodied heads.
Who is Clark Welch?
Clark Welch is, I would count him as one of the 2 or 3 most amazing people I've met in my life. He was a commander of a company, the Delta Company of the Black Lions, in that battle. He had come up through the ranks. He was only a lieutenant. It was very rare for a lieutenant to be a commander of a company, but he was so strong and well regarded that they gave him his own company. And he tried very hard to talk the commanders out of marching into the jungle that fateful day. He suspected that it was going to be trouble. He was overruled, largely because of pressure coming down all the way from Washington and from Westmoreland and from the general leading the 1st Division, General Hay, upon the battalion commander, Terry Allen Jr., to just go out and find the Viet Cong and fix them in place and kill them. There was so much pressure that Clark Welch wasn't listened to when he tried to talk Terry Allen out of that. He fought in the battle. He fought heroically. Many of his soldiers were killed in that battle. He was haunted by that for a lifetime. When I found him, he was the most difficult of the many, many soldiers that I encountered to interview. He didn't want to talk. He was hiding in the hills of Colorado at that point, fearful that some loved one would find him and say, "You're responsible for the death of my son or my husband or brother," even though he had fought heroically. And so, but he was the crucial figure in the book in the end. And after agreeing to talk with me, he went back to Vietnam with me and shared with me hundreds of his letters.
Well, Book TV traveled with you to Vietnam as well in 2002, I believe.
Yes, it was.
Yep. And we want to introduce our viewers to Clark Welch.
Great.
I wanted to go to Vietnam. My wife supported it. It was not surprising at all when I wasn't ordered to Vietnam. It was as if my prayers were answered. I wanted to go to Vietnam. I belonged to Special Forces then, and the crest of the Special Forces and the motto, as I understand it, means to liberate the oppressed. And I fell for that. I truly, when the Special Forces sent me to South America, I thought I was going working for the President of the United States to liberate the oppressed people. And when we all discovered that there were people in Vietnam that were being oppressed, and there was a chance to liberate the oppressed, I fell for that. I believed it. I absolutely believed in it with my everything. We did what we were supposed to do. First in the morning, and the enemy came down the trail, and we ambushed them. And we killed them. We knocked them all down. There was about 6 of them. And they were pushing bicycles. And they didn't shoot back. I mean, we just fired, and then it was over. And when I came out on the road to see if we could take a prisoner and make sure they were dead, see if they had any identification, the little bicycle in front, the bicycle had been knocked over. And when the little person, when I went to see if they were still alive, we'd take them prisoner, but to see if they had anything, any identification, any uniform or anything. It was a girl. It was a little girl, and little girl like that. Jesus Christ. I didn't think I'd do that.
This is a complicated story.
That's Clark Welch. He has a huge heart, and he's a soldier and armed, carrying arms his whole life. And that's what made him so fascinating to me, the complexity of his feelings about why he went to Vietnam, the way he felt afterwards, betrayed by his government, that incredible sensibility about people and yet the ability to kill as well. All of that was within Clark Welch. And I haven't encountered anybody who's met him who hasn't been affected deeply by his humanity. He and I probably disagree on almost every political thing, except we have this connection because I see that deep humanity in him. And he understood that I was going to tell the truth, and that's really what bonded us. But, he is sort of a Gary Cooper character. He has a lot of integrity, but also that complexity, as you see in his reaction to what he had to do, what he did in Vietnam.
Where did this title come from?
They Marched into Sunlight is from a poem by a Vietnam vet and great poet named Bruce Weigel. And as I was starting my my research, as I do with almost every book, I dig into poetry. Because I along with presenting, I'm a nonfiction writer. Facts are incredibly important to me, but I'm also looking for sensibilities. I don't overtly preach in any of my books, but you can see my sensibility in each of them, and poetry is one of the ways that evokes that.
From They Marched into Sunlight, when Cathay Pacific Flight 765 from Hong Kong touched down at Ho Chi Minh City on the morning of January 27th, 2002, here I was, finally, Decades late, the effing new guy. This was my first visit to a country that I had only had imagined, for better and worse. With my wife at my side, I looked out the window from seat 45C as the airplane rolled toward the terminal. Everything seems exotic the first time. Guard towers, machine guns, uniforms of deep olive green and dark red, motorbikes racing our jet on a parallel dirt road, 3 packs of teenage boys clinging to each seat, a hive of gray hangars, giant, culvert-like cement half-moons that once provided cover for U.S. helicopters. Patient queues of travelers at the checkpoints inside, more soldiers, stone-cold serious, born after the war was over, a clattering, expectant sea of people, waiting outside, fingers gripping the chain-link fence, heads straining for the first glimpse of arriving relatives bringing appliances and cardboard boxes full of other material wonders from the world beyond. Then into the sunlight and a surprising jolt of exhilaration in the steamy Saigon heat.
You know, I did not fight in Vietnam. I did not cover the Vietnam War. I got there very late in 2002. But partly because of that, my senses were completely alive to every single thing. I would say that those 2 weeks in Vietnam, as some later trips for other books to exotic places, I felt every sense more alive than I ever have in my whole life, the whole time. I was aware of everything. Sometimes you go through weeks and months of your life and it's a blur. And then there are moments when everything just comes in technicolor and has a deeper meaning to it, and that was that trip.
David Maraniss, you've had another life, and that's with the Washington Post. How'd you get connected with the Post?
Pure luck. I grew up after Detroit, moved to Madison, Wisconsin, an idyllic city. My father was the city editor and then the editor of the Capital Times in Madison. I met my wife there. We had our 2 children there, Andrew and Sarah, and I realized that if I didn't leave, I'd be trapped there my whole life. Trapped in a good sense, but nonetheless limited. So in 1974, I set off to the East Coast to apply for newspaper jobs.
This is after graduating University of Wisconsin?
I did not graduate at that point. But after I was a journalist in Wisconsin, I was actually working for WIBA Radio, writing my own newscasts, 15-minute newscasts. I remember in 1972, I would literally take my father's newspaper, the Capital Times, would run Woodward and Bernstein on the front page, strip it across the top. And I had my own 15-minute newscast. And I would take that story from the day and get some actuality, as they call it in radio, some soundbite from the Republican National Committee and put them together and rewrite Woodward and Bernstein. So I've always joked to Bob that I've been rewriting him for long before I even knew him. But anyway, that's what I was doing in Madison at that point. But I wanted to be a newspaper guy. Went out to the East Coast, applied for jobs up and down the East Coast, from Providence and Boston and Hartford, and then went down to Coney Island where my Aunt Celia lived. And I went to Nathan's famous hot dog stand and left my clips there. What clips I had, I'd done some movie reviews and high school sports for the Cap Times in Madison. Got down to Trenton, New Jersey, and it had just been purchased by the Washington Post. And they'd sent up this tough old Marine, Dick Harwood, to be the editor. And I walked in, and I was at a loss. So I said to him, I left my clips at Nathan's famous hot dog stand, but if you hire me, I'll be your best reporter in 6 months. Then I went back to Madison, and on Christmas Eve, at like 10 or 11 o'clock, the phone rings. Ho, 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 this is Dick Harwood. I can't pay your way out here, but I'll give you a shot for 6 months, and if you're no good, you're gone. So I packed up, Linda and I packed up. Andrew was 4 and Sarah was not yet 1, and we drove a little blue Vega out to New Jersey, and that's where it all started. And after a short period of time, Harwood decided I was his best reporter, and when he went back to the Washington Post 2 years later, he took me with him.
That was 1977?
77, I get to Washington.
You're often described as Pulitzer Prize-winning David Maraniss.
I am?
It's one of those titles
I guess so, yeah.
grabs a hold. What did you win the Pulitzer for?
I won the Pulitzer for my coverage of Bill Clinton in 1992 for the Washington Post. I was then the Southwest Bureau Chief for the paper. We were living in Austin, Texas. Arkansas was part of my territory, but I was really, by that point, basically living in Austin but covering national politics and sociology and other things. Before, in 1991, I wrote a memo to my editors. Bob Kaiser, in particular, was the managing editor then. And I said, I think Bill Clinton's going to be the next president of the United States. And I want to spend an entire year just looking into various aspects of his life and the forces that shaped him, so that when, not if, but when he's president, people will have a deeper understanding of this very complex person. And they let me do it. For the most part, there were a few points where Ross Perot was making a lot of noise and they wanted to take me off some people wanted to take me off the story, but Kaiser kept supporting me. And so I wrote 13 or 14 deeper stories about Bill Clinton that ran that year, everything ranging from Clinton and race to Clinton in the poultry industry to Clinton and ethics to Clinton and economics, all of these different aspects of his life, Clinton and faith. And those are the stories that won the Pulitzer Prize. And then the day after the election, I woke up in what I describe as a hellhole motel room on the outskirts of Little Rock. So this is 92, I was 43 years old, and I woke up at 5:30 in the morning and said, I've got to write this book. I think I know Clinton better than anyone else. I'll regret it if someone else does it. It's a story that means something to me, both because of the drama of his life and the fact that he was the first member of my generation to become president. And so that's my first book.
And First in His Class is the name of that book. And to quote from that book, the notion that Bill Clinton began his political career as a radical and moved inexorably rightward over the decades is misleading. He was a cautious defender of the establishment during his student politics days at Georgetown. In his Oxford and Yale years, he was in the moderate wing of the anti-war movement. From the beginning of his ascent in Arkansas, he would attack organized labor and court corporate interests when it served his political purposes.
You know, it seems kind of preposterous now in a sense, but that's modern American politics, that when he was running, the right wing was trying to portray him as some kind of radical. Bill Clinton was never a radical. He did oppose the war, but it's a misperception that, I mean, there are many ways to criticize President Clinton and others, but you got to get it right. And there's always an attempt to demonize somebody, and then you miss the real failings of them or their strengths. My main thesis about Bill Clinton really was not so much political as predictive, in the sense that I could see in his life this repetitive cycle of loss and recovery. And that's really what drew me through an understanding of him from the earliest days all the way through his presidency, that when he was down, he would figure a way to recover. And when he was on top, he would see the seeds of his own destruction. And that repetitive cycle really is what defined Bill Clinton, along with his pragmatic politics.
First in His Class came out in 1995. David Maraniss, something that's appropriate to talk about today. Rodham viewed the college years as a time when she could try out different personalities and lifestyles, she explained in a letter to Don Jones, her youth pastor. But it is an important aspect of her personality that even then there was a self-aware, moderate aspect to her experimentation. In another letter to Jones, she talked about intentionally playing different roles at different times. Now the social activist, now sticking to the books, and occasionally adopting a kind of party mode. She claimed that she even got outrageous at times, but immediately modified the assessment. as outrageous as a moral Methodist can get. In her search for identity, she thought of herself now as a progressive, an ethical Christian, and a political activist. For those who are currently watching and judging her behavior later in life, when she seems to play contrasting roles at different times, here asserting her maiden name, there relinquishing it, here deferring to her husband, there instructing him on what to do, here posing like a model for the cover of traditional women's magazines, there emphasizing substance over style, here searching for the moral meaning of life, there playing the commodities markets to make a quick buck, here disparaging cookie-baking housewives, there peddling her chocolate chip recipe. It is instructive to know that she was self-consciously ever thus.
So I wrote that in 1995. I think it still holds up, probably with one thing to add to that, which is that my larger take on Hillary Rodham Clinton is that she has been affected more by her husband's behavior and ups and downs than anyone else in the world. And so over the course of their presidency, which, you know, many of the major troubles took place after this book was written, I think you can still see that same Hillary Clinton, but I think the defensiveness that was not there at the beginning. She was experimental or trying to be in modest ways and never quite sure of herself in the same way that Clinton was. I often, and I don't want people to take this the wrong way, but I've often said that Bill Clinton is an authentic phony in that whatever he's doing at the time, he believes in and he can make you believe in. And Hillary, to her credit, is a phony. She's not as good at it. So even when you see her back when I'm writing about there trying to be all these different parts, she's not quite comfortable with any of them in the same way that her husband can appear to be comfortable whatever he's doing. And I think that has not served her well, even though I find her to be an incredibly competent person. I think there's always this sense of, who is she?
Good afternoon. Welcome to Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is our monthly in-depth program. This is where we invite one author on to talk about his or her body of work. And this month, it's Washington Post Associate Editor and author David Maraniss. Mr. Maraniss has been writing books since 1995. Here's a quick list of them. First in his class, a biography of Bill Clinton was the first one, and then the next year, Tell Newt to Shut Up came out. The Clinton Enigma came out in 1998. When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi, 1999. The Prince of Tennessee, Al Gore Meets His Fate, came out in 2000. They Marched into Sunlight, War and Peace, Vietnam and America, October 1967. That came out in 2003. Clemente, The Passion and Grace of Baseball's Last Hero, 2006. Rome, 1960. The Summer Olympics That Stirred the World, 2008. Into the Story, A Writer's Journey Through Life, Politics, Sports, and Loss, came out in 2010. Barack Obama, The Story, 2012. And Once in a Great City, A Detroit Story, came out this year. Now, this is an interactive program, and we've spent 45 minutes or so talking, and we want to get you involved as well. We're going to put the phone lines up on the screen. If you would like to talk with David Maraniss, as you could see, there's lots of topics that can be talked about today. 202 is the area code. 748-8200 for those of you in the East and Central time zones. 748-8201 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Now, if you can't get through on the phone line, still want to make a comment, try social media. Let's begin with Facebook, facebook.com/booktv. You'll see right up there at the top some video of Mr. Maraniss. You can go ahead and post a comment right underneath it. You could also email us at booktv@cspan.org. At BookTV is our Twitter handle. You can make a comment there as well. And finally, you can also text in a message if you would like to. Now, this is not for calling, but this is for text. 202-717-9684 is our text number. And if you would, just include your first name and your town so we can at least know that much about you before we get started. David Maraniss, in your book, Barack Obama, The Story, You write, and I hope I can find my quote right away here, no life could have been more the product of randomness than that of Barack Obama.
Well, every life is random. His is maybe more random. A chance meeting of an African student at the University of Hawaii with a young woman who had moved there because of her peripatetic father in a Russian language class. All of it just, there's so many different aspects of what got those people to that place that seem random. And the fact that it really was a romance or whatever that didn't last, and that he came out of that is just extraordinary. So the point of this book, the story, is really to show how much of a product of the entire world Barack Obama is, and yet how American that story is.
How well did he know his father?
He didn't know his father well at all. He met him once in his life. When the father came to Honolulu, when Barack was in maybe third grade, and spent about 10 days there with the family. And it was a pretty tense 10 days or so, and that's the only time he ever saw him in his whole life, aside from when he was too young to remember. The father was there for the first few months of Obama's life until the mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, and her young baby moved back to Seattle, from whence she had come when she was in high school.
What was she like?
She was a fabulous character. Very strong-minded, independent, smart, sort of went her own way, was very committed to social justice, and had a troubled marital life, first with Barack Obama Sr. and then with Lolo Soetoro, an Indonesian. She spent much of her adult life overseas. She raised two children who loved her, but particularly her son, Barack, felt at times, if not abandoned by her, angry that she wasn't around. He lived much of his high school years with his grandparents, the Dunhams in Honolulu, while she was still in Indonesia. But she was in the vanguard of the microfinancing movement. She worked at various times for the Ford Foundation and other enterprises that were trying to help and empower women around the world, particularly in Indonesia and in the Asian subcontinent. And she died very young, sadly, when Barack was in his early 20s or mid-20s.
What was it like? He's, 54 today. The president's 54 years old. What was it like for him in Hawaii being raised by two white grandparents?
Well, it wasn't a dysfunctional situation in any way. I think that he had a lot to overcome, both because of the fact that his mother wasn't there, that he was struggling to figure out who he was. Hawaii was a very polyglot culture, but there weren't that many African Americans. The few that were there were mostly affiliated with the military because of the military bases in Honolulu. But he was, it's interesting. I don't in any way discount the struggles that young Barry Obama, as he was called then, endured at the private school he went to, Punahou High School. But because he was trying to find his identity as an African American in a place where there weren't many. But everybody was dealing with that to some degree or another. A lot of people thought Obama, if they didn't see him, they'd think he was Japanese. It's a Japanese name too. And there were many, many Japanese Americans in Honolulu. You couldn't tell. I call them Hapas. There were so many kids who were half Anglo and half something else. or half Portuguese and half Native Hawaiian, or all of these different mixes. And he was just part of that. And that, I think, had a very profound positive effect on him. As much as he did have to struggle with finding his identity as a black man, which he didn't do until many years later. Growing up in Hawaii really introduced him to this multicultural world that allowed him to have a universal sensibility, which is one of his many strengths.
You describe his grandfather as a character, kind of a lost character.
Oh, yeah.
A Willie Loman.
Yeah, Stanley Dunham, you know, where to start with him? But he at one point he thought he was a writer, and he went out to California for a while and came back and was trying to impress the woman who would be his wife, Madeline Payne Dunham, with the fact that he met John Steinbeck out there and was hanging out with these different writers. And Madeline's brother went to the trunk where Stanley claimed he had all these writings, and there was nothing in there. The suitcase was empty. And he was always he was searching for something. So the family really started this long search with him looking for a place where he'd feel comfortable, you know, traveling through Oklahoma and Texas, and then going further west to Seattle, where he was a furniture salesman, and then out to Hawaii, as far west as you can go. You know, it's sort of this westward movement, a migration, a search for something. And he was very, he was a good talker, he was a good salesman, but there wasn't that much behind it. And one of the more moving scenes in President Obama's memoir, Dreams from My Father, is sort of watching his grandfather get up the courage to make the calls as an insurance salesman, and you know, on a Sunday night, all these cold calls and all of that aspect, which is pretty Willie Loman-ish, and sort of the sadness behind some of that.
You also reveal in that story that his grandmother was an alcoholic.
Yes, and I knew that, but it hadn't been reported. But President Obama, in my interview with him, acknowledged it in the Oval Office.
And an active alcoholic, or drinking.
She was still drinking. Yeah, she never stopped that I know of. But I have to say that I didn't do extensive reporting on that, but there was enough for me to see that it wasn't. You know, I'm not an expert on alcoholism, but she was it never affected her professional career that I could tell. She was a very well-regarded person in the banking industry in Honolulu. She was the rock of the family. She was the one who really brought home the money and was very practical and pragmatic in helping her two grandchildren, Barack, Barry, and Maya, sort of helping raise both of them. So it really didn't show. She would come home and drink. She was a private home drinker, alcoholic.
David Maraniss, what was it like for these two white people from Kansas to raise a black grandson?
Well, Stanley would go around telling people in Hawaii that his grandson was a Hawaiian prince or a descendant of Hawaiian princes, you know, because Barack, you know, he could look sort of Hawaiian too sometimes, and that was when he was younger. When Barry, I'm sorry, he was called Barry until he went to college, so I'll call him that in this period. When Barry was in high school, Stanley tried to introduce him to some African Americans in Honolulu, and so he was conscious of that part of the need for it. Madeline, you know, growing up in Kansas, there actually that part of Kansas where they were from, near Wichita, in El Dorado and Augusta, there were African Americans in those towns in Kansas. It was, you know, it was a free state. and every town had an African-American community in it. So it wasn't completely alien to them, but nonetheless, it had to have been a challenge for them to figure out how to raise this young man, and they did it essentially without focusing too much on race. And again, there's a scene in that I deal with in my book that Barack, President Obama, mentions in his memoir of his grandmother, waiting for a bus at a bus stop near their apartment in Honolulu, and coming back and complaining that there's a strange-looking African-American man out there who's bothering her, and Barack trying to deal with his mixed feelings about how his grandmother is reacting to that situation.
And the apartment building where Barack Obama was raised in Honolulu. You also traveled to Africa for this story. We want to show some video and then have you describe it. And this is from January 2010.
We've traveled around this part of Western Kenya, based in Kisumu, which is kind of the capital of this part of the country. And it's sort of informally called Luo land because the main tribe out here are the Luo, and that is the tribe from which Barack Obama's family came. We drove from Kisumu down to a little town called Uigas, where we interviewed Barack Obama's only living paternal aunt, the sister of Barack Obama Sr., living in a small, mud-floored, one-room house back in the back streets of this tiny village, with only a couple of couches there and about 5 pictures and a few calendars on the wall, and most of them related to the President of the United States. This is the reality behind so many sort of things that you think you know but you don't really know. And it's when I go out and really see vibrant life and things that I never could see in my lifetime any other way than because of what I do, that I just think, wow, I am so lucky.
His only surviving blood aunt.
Alma Magak. One of the sort of revelations of that trip to Western Kenya was to see the contrast between the people, the relatives, quote unquote, that President Obama wrote about in his memoir, versus some other relatives who are largely forgotten, who are closer blood relatives. So in his memoir, the main character of his visits to Kenya is Mama Sarah, or Grandma Sarah, who lived in Kogelo, north of where we just were showing. And when we got to her house, it was surrounded by fences. There were guards there, all sorts of subalterns sort of protecting her. There were trinket salesmen outside. She had become sort of the queen mother of Kenya, because of her fame, because of his memoir and the fact that he was now president. She was not related to him. She was married to President Obama's grandfather much after President Obama's father was born. He had a different mother who had left, escaped from the grandfather with the kids. As a matter of fact, Barack Obama Sr. really despised Mama Sarah, did not like her at all. They didn't get along. And yet she becomes the major figure, and that's who President Obama sees in his trips back to Africa, while